We're live. Thank you. So thank you guys for coming today. We're going to talk about some modern CSS that you can use on your websites now. These are all things that have been adopted by the most recent version of all of the browsers, including mobile. And so you can start using it now, depending on your project requirements. If you have never used these tools before, that's okay. I won't go into super detail about all of them because it's a lot to cover, but definitely ask me questions as I go if I miss something or if something is unclear. So I'm Alexis Findison. I work for Chief. I'm Associate Director of Technology there. I've been there for about 2 years. We are a marketing firm, and we build Drupal websites, WordPress websites. We do all of the print and ad campaigns as well, and branding. So come and talk to me if you're interested in that kind of work. We're also hiring developers. We're specifically looking for a senior WordPress dev, which I know this is the wrong audience for, but just in case, we might have some, agnostic developers in the crowd. We're also hiring project managers and strategists and designers. Please go to our website and check us out. So if you want to follow along with the slides, I put them up on the web. This way you don't have to write down all of these code snippets, because it would be a lot. All right, so today we're going to be talking about a whole lot. We're going to be starting off with some new layout tools, Flexbox and CSS Grids. You may have used some of these before. If it's new to you, that's okay. We're also going to be talking about some additional design tools that you can use, such as pseudo elements, transitions, and blend modes, as well as texturing your typography. This is pretty cutting edge. This one is the least supported, but there are plenty of ways that you can do it in the modern browsers while still supporting the old ones. How many people in here use Sass? Okay, good showing. All right. Most of the things in here will be regular CSS, so don't be intimidated if you don't use Sass. There are a couple places where there's like an ampersand here, or like a nested element there. It's okay. I'll explain it if you have questions. So the other thing about these new tools is, but wait, that's not supported in IE9. I need that for my client. That's okay. You can still use some parts of this with some fallbacks. The important part here is to look into your own website statistics. The audience that's going to your website, that's the most important part. You don't need to worry about global statistics, but you do need to worry about trends emerging in the industry. So if there's a new browser that people are picking up pretty rapidly, maybe you should think about that, and maybe a little less so about, Safari 3. All right, so diving right in, Flexbox. This is basically stretchy columns. This is really useful for matching column height or making sure that things adjust to each other within a row or a column. You can also use this to modify the DOM order. When you do that, you need to be really careful about accessibility because the markup will actually remain in the same order. It's just that visually you'll be reordering it. So screen readers are going to have a really hard time if you're taking something from the bottom of your markup and putting it visually all the way at the top. It's going to be very confusing. So make sure that your hierarchy is correct. So Flexbox is useful for situations like this. This is taken from the National Park Foundation website that we built last year. This is a view. And so you can think about Flexbox in terms of two pieces. You're going to be applying to a container and also to the elements within that container. So that's something like a view content div and a view row div. So with this, it's a very common situation where you need the height of a card to be identical, even though the titles are all different. It's like one of those really irritating problems to match the design. And so some of the ways that people have done this in the past is using absolute positioning, arbitrarily setting a height that's like really tall, and then when you have short columns, you get a big gap at the bottom of all of them. This helps you avoid that. It'll adjust the shorter columns to be the height of your tallest column, and that'll be across each row. So if you have one row that has a tall column and another row that doesn't, they're not going to match in height. They'll match across that row. Another situation where you can use this is in a situation where you have items that need to flow within a row but maybe won't always fit. So in this example, you can see these 3 links at the bottom: plan your visit, found my park, and share on Facebook, how they're stacking right now. It doesn't have enough room for all 3 to sit next to each other at this breakpoint, but you can see here that when we stretch it wider, they all sit next to each other automatically. This is called row wrap. You can do this automatically with one line. It's pretty snazzy. So the actual code for this. First of all, the majority of what you're going to want to do is on the wrapper itself, not on the items. You have additional overrides that you can set on the items, but primarily what you're going to be doing is on the container. This is true for Flexbox and for CSS Grids. So you're going to go in. The only thing that you really need is display flex. That'll get you set up, and everything within the container will then try to situate itself next to its sibling elements. These additional items are for alignment. So if you want something to sit vertically along the top or along the bottom, if you want to center everything up, you can do that with these tools. I won't go into all of the specifics here. I highly recommend going to Code Drops or CSS Tricks for code demos so that you can see it working practically speaking. I just didn't have quite enough time to fit all of the code demos into this talk. That would be a Flexbox only talk. And then if you want to override that alignment for one particular item, say you have 6 items in a row and the first 4 need to be aligned with each other, but then the last 2 need to be aligned to the bottom. You can do that with align self. And also you can set hierarchy in terms of proportions here. So flex grow and flex shrink are really useful if you have, say, a headline and some detail text and you want your headline to span wider if it possibly can. You can set flex grow in that situation to 1 or 2 and on that one particular item, and all the other items will be secondary. So if there's room for the item that has flex grow to be applied, it'll set that first and fill up any extra space. So we'll talk about some not to uses. Again, just hammering on that accessibility concern. I know that a lot of people in here, because it's GovCon, are working for the government. We need to worry about that. We also need to worry about that for non-government websites. We're thinking about 10% of the population here that has some kind of disability, and so we want to be empathetic to those users and make sure that they are getting a good experience with your website. Otherwise, you're missing out on readers, on donors, and on volunteers. So try and keep it in mind. So the fallbacks here, this is important. It's a whole slew of stuff. The key thing here is that Internet Explorer was actually the first to implement Flexbox. So IE 11 is using an older version of the spec than Safari, Chrome, and Firefox. So IE 11 will do it for you. It's just going to have a little bit of awkward adjustments to be made. That said, it will respond really well. Usually if you're going to be supporting IE 11, you might also need to support IE 10, in which case you can set a width on your elements, set them to be inline block or floated next to each other. And then Flexbox will simply override that if you set it later in your declaration list. So maybe in IE10, you have a hard 20% on one of your items, and then you have a flex grow on it, and at 1024, it'll get bigger beyond the 20% because it can, if it has that space. All of these items are found on caniuse.com. I highly recommend going there and checking it out for each one of these tools that you can use. It's basically my Bible. This is amazing. And then it'll also give you some links to the specs so that you can go in and make sure that you're covering your bases. Always do testing. Make sure that before you're pushing up to your development environment or staging environment that you're testing locally across a few different browsers. You can also use Browser Stack if you have a subscription to that. Who here uses Browser Stack? A few. Okay. Browser Stack is a great tool to emulate devices. So if you don't have a Windows computer on hand and you need to test IE11, you can use Browser Stack to do so. CSS Grids. So with CSS Grids, this is very similar to Flexbox. However, CSS Grids is even more powerful than Flexbox. You can do vertical and horizontal tricks with CSS Grids at the same time. Flexbox is really used for one row or one column and everything formatting the same way across it. Whereas with CSS Grids, you can create basically a newspaper layout with lots of nested divs and without the nesting and subsections and that kind of thing. So this is really helpful for laying out large sections. You can also use this for your basic gallery layouts just like you would with Flexbox. Again, find your National Park Foundation. This was created before CSS Grids was properly supported, but it is now. And so if I have the opportunity, this is a really great use case for CSS Grids. So we have a grid of elements that are all differently sized and need to float next to each other. Because of how this needed to flow on mobile, I had to wrap it with a whole bunch of extra divs, and it was a big pain in the butt. And with CSS Grids, I could have done this in about 30 lines of code. So it's much simpler, and it'll keep your markup a little cleaner. So with CSS Grids, you can basically take any block and put it anywhere you want. We're going to start with setting up your container first, just like we did with Flexbox. The key thing to remember with CSS Grids is that it works off of a numbering system. And so each line is in between your columns. So the start of a column, the end of a column, the start of a column, the end of a column, start of a row, the end of a row. So it's all the in between. It's all the binding, like with a book. So your first line is actually the very left edge. Your second line is that green highlighted one. So what we do with this is we create columns and rows, also called tracks. You'll see that coming up in various tutorials, tracks. So what we want to do is say display grid, similar to how we did display flex. And then you can set up columns and rows for that grid. And then everything within will automatically sit inside of that grid. So here I've set the widths and the names for my columns. So you can think about it as the width and then the name between the two numbered columns. Normally you would have to do this specifically. You would need to say between 1 and 2, and between 2 and 3, and between 3 and 4. But I find the naming to be much more intuitive. I highly recommend taking this approach instead. because you're going to be thinking about it as my first column, not about column between 1 and 2. And I find that a naming convention similar to full start and full end for the very outside edges, and then main start and main end for the inside edges for a 3-column grid are very helpful. And then you can set up your items after that to say where exactly within that grid they fall. So you'll be saying, even if something is really far down the page and you want it to be in the first position, you can do that. You can drag it up to be on top. You get an automatic z-index with this. It positions directly on top, kind of like absolute positioning. So be careful about how you're placing your grid elements. And then this is talking about grid areas. So this is a little bit more complex. This is where you say that I want an area between the first row in the first column to the second row in the first column. And that's my area 1. And that's really useful for something like an aside or a block quote, that kind of a thing, to shunt it off to the edge. You can also set these up in larger regions, something like your entire page layout I've seen be done before. You can set it up so that your header is a grid area, that your footer is a grid area, your main body region is a grid area. And then additionally, you can set specific items to break outside of the grid if you need them to by setting the outer margins as a grid column. And you can set those to be specific hard pixel points, like we have here. You can also do fractional units, which is incredibly useful. Say you have an area that's 800 pixels wide and you need to split it up evenly into maybe a 25, a 25, and a 50% area. What you can do is say 1 fractional unit, 1 fractional unit, 2 fractional units, and it'll fill that space automatically without having to set percentages. You can also use percentages. Something key to remember about the naming of columns and rows and areas is that when you compile Sass, it's going to have a little trouble with that. So set a variable for your different areas and then put the variable in your declaration. Kind of one of those weird gotchas. Sass just can't quite handle it yet. And then basically just don't overuse it. If a simple inline block or a float is going to do the trick, you don't need to over-engineer it. The old stuff still works. No problem there. And then also CSS Grids, if you only have 1 row or 1 column that you want to format, you may as well just use Flexbox. It's a little faster. It'll do what you want it to do right away. So browser limits. Basically, you can't use it in IE 10 and earlier. You can use it in IE 11 and Edge. So what we're doing is we're writing our contracts specifically to support the most recent versions of browsers. As an agency, we found that to be worthwhile because Microsoft is dropping support for the older versions of IE, and it wasn't a very hard sell to our clients based off of the security concerns of the older specs. That said, if you do need to support older browsers, try setting a percentage on a float as your fallback.
Is it responsive, the grid?
Yes.
It is?
Yes, especially if you use fractional units. And you can set your declarations. Sorry, I'll repeat the question. Is it responsive? So if you go in, let me get back to my code. So if you go in and you set these declarations, ordinarily we want everything to be about one column in mobile, but at tablet and desktop you can set a breakpoint, set up your grid based on that breakpoint, and then override it again at your larger breakpoint. Always thinking about mobile first. That's kind of my default. Yeah.
Are there any issues with using Flexbox inside of CSS Grids? So if you do the page in CSS Grids,
yeah.
And then you put a Flexbox, container in one of those areas, are there any issues or incompatibilities or anything like that?
You are absolutely free to use Flexbox inside of CSS Grids. That's totally cool. In fact, a lot of people are doing that now for their entire layouts. They're not even using floats. They're just nesting Flexbox inside of CSS Grid. Yeah. Cool. All right. Any other questions about CSS Grids or Flexbox? Yeah.
Are you still able for users, I know when it comes down to accessibility, this has been pointed out, even before these tools became available, is sometimes, of course, as we as designers want to come in and have a site that looks good on mobile, but we disable pinch and zoom. And I know that can be an issue with site. Are you still able to pinch and zoom on these layouts?
I don't know if you can pinch and zoom. I haven't tested it. Tweet at me.
I will.
If you try it out, let me know how it works.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, cool. Alrighty. So pseudo elements are basically pieces on the page that you don't necessarily need to be available as content. So if you don't need something to be available to a screen reader, but it does need to be visually there, you can do that. This is for things like, well, this. For things like icon fonts, you can add an icon to, say, add a map pin to a link that also says, check out our location, maybe. And also to add additional rules across designs. It's a common use case for that. So you can see here these icons here. We already have text describing what that activity will be, but we needed to have an icon as well, just for a little extra design sauce. So we added these elements as before elements to the list item that is the text itself. So in doing that, you can say, setting your before element, you'll set your content to be a particular character of your icon font. You can also do this with SVGs and PNGs and GIFs, any kind of image element that you want to place before or after an element. Basically, you can create anything with this. It'll act exactly like any other div on your page. And then additionally, I added this underline underneath the National Park Foundation link and the external link icon. Both of these are pseudo elements. The icon is an after element and the underline is a before element, just positioned down. And the reason I do that for links is that then you can apply a transition to that underline, unlike using text decoration. So you can have it fade in, you can have it change color, you can have all of that happen really smoothly, change width, etc. And then also, this is the home page of Find Your Park. This additional little textured bar at the top is the motif is a scrapbook, and so we needed to have this tape element. But I didn't want to have to create a div or a span that's empty just to make that. So I created a before element, set the width and height and positioning and background color and background image on it. And then there it is. It's perfect. It's not adding any clutter to my markup, and it's still on the page. So the key here is to set position relative onto your parent element, because it'll help you position your before or after element a little more easily. So you can see here that we just have display block on it. We have a width and a height, some margin. You can float this. you can inline it, you can do everything that you would want to do with this. And this is supported all the way back to IE 9. So this is primo. Don't be afraid of using this. However, don't use it if you need that text to be available to screen readers. If you have an element that it would be helpful to have a little extra text above it, like recently we had a situation where we had filters on a view and we wanted the word refine to be before it. Now, the lazy way to do this would be to just use a before element and in your content say refine. However, screen readers aren't going to be able to see that. So you're losing that context for those visitors to your website. So, be cognizant of it. Sometimes you'll have to take the harder route, but it'll at least make implementing your design elements a lot easier. Any questions about before and after elements? Okay. The other one that I listed in here is nth-child, which I neglected to make a slide for. Sorry about that. But nth-child basically is to say that if you have a list of elements, again, using views row as our example, you can take that and say, I want only the second one of those views rows to have this particular style, or I want to zebra stripe. You can say nth-child and then basically a math equation to say which one you want. So if it's literally the second one, you can say, I think it starts with 0, so you would say 1. And then if you want to alternate, you can add a multiplier to that. So you could say 2n for all of your even items. And then also line height in IE9, IE10, IE11. Pseudo elements are not going to respect your line height. I haven't really run into any issues with that, but it's there in case you run into issues with it. It's a known thing. And then the other thing is with form elements. I like to add my my little arrows to the right-hand side of the select. You can't do that on the select itself. Thankfully, Drupal always gives us the handy form select wrapper, so you can apply it there and absolutely position it over top of your select, and then add pointer events none in order to make sure that you're not like clicking on that instead of on the select. Transitions and animations. This is like the largest, most complex piece that I'm going to go through very quickly. You can do really marvelous things with one line, and you can do so many complex things with it, but I'm just going to go over a little bit. This is a very jam-packed session. So basically, if you want some kind of interaction on your page to happen, and you want to add a little bit of flair to it, make it seem a little bit more slick, a little more high-tech, a little more friendly or bubbly, you can add that kind of personality with animations. So this is something for you to collaborate with your designer on when you're looking at their comps, or if you're a designer, talk to your dev about it. Be like, hey, I was thinking that this particular element could bounce when you click it, or that this other element could, the background color could explode out from the middle when you hover over it. That's the kind of thing that you can do with this. It's pretty cool. So I have a short video here just to show you a simple use of this. I use it a lot on buttons, but you can see here we're using it as an overlay on the images. But it's just this fade between the colors that is the transition. Did everybody see it? Okay. It's a short clip. So basically, when you go in there, you have a bunch of things that you can set, but you don't have to. There's an easy way to do this. And all you have to do is say what property you want to transition and then how long you want it to transition for. You can use seconds, you can use milliseconds. I tend to use 0.2 seconds. It tends to feel about right for most animations, most of those quicker animations. But you can set this to be as long as you want. It could be 10 minutes, I guess. And then as far as the elements that you can transition, again, you can't use text decoration. It's not going to do anything for you. Not really sure why browsers don't do that, but there it is. But anything else, I have not run into any other problems with this. On widths, on position relative to position absolute, on font sizes, colors, background colors, on those before and after elements, like we were talking about before, you can really do a lot with this. And then additionally, if you want to go beyond this, there's the additional tools that you can do here. So property, duration, timing function is an interesting one. By default, it's linear, but you can also do ease in, ease out. You can do a bicubic function, which is pretty cool to do something really snazzy. There are like a lot of websites out there that'll help you predict how it's going to flow. There's also a tool inside of Chrome that'll help you tweak your Bezier curves for your transitions, which is pretty cool. And then delay is how long you want to wait before starting the function. And then if you want to do a couple of these all in a row on one element, you just comma separate it and set your next element and transition if you want it to be different. So you could have the color changing at one rate and you could have the width changing at another rate. You can get pretty complex with this. It's very, very cool. And here are all your definitions, just in case you wanted to read up more about them later with the slide deck. So here I have an example with milliseconds. So 0.2 seconds is equal to 200 milliseconds. Basically, just don't overdo it. You don't want to have one of those sites from the 90s with the like rainbow cat following your mouse around and like, stars flashing all over the place. It's distracting. It should be subtle and add to the experience, but it shouldn't be something that people notice right away to be like, oh, look at that, because then the content's the most important part. So let's get them to the content and just enhance that experience of the content without them really realizing it. So again, I encourage you to try these things out, but when you're talking about it for practical purposes, try and keep it, keep it cool. You don't want your site going out of fashion in 3 months. All right, so a few tricky bits here. If you have an SVG on the page and you're trying to transition fill colors, that's basically the background color of an SVG, except it's called fill. This is for on-page SVGs where you've taken the markup and printed it directly, not using it as a background image or as a source for an image. So you just can't transition the fill color, but that's okay. It'll still change from color to color. It's just not going to be quite as pretty as if you're doing it in some other browsers. And then background size is also a tricky one. If you wanted to hover over a div that had a background image on it and have the background image get bigger, it's not going to do that below IE10 and including IE10. But again, it'll still make the change, it just won't ease it. And then calc values get a little bit complicated, and pseudo elements on older browsers. Blend modes are pretty cool. You can do a lot of things in browser that you would do in Photoshop. The trick here is to remember that older browsers need to still have legible text. So if you're setting a blend mode on something and it's perfectly legible in Chrome, but you're depending on that background color to be present in order to have the right color contrast, you're going to run into some problems on some older browsers. So there are two tools that you can use to do this. Mix blend mode will blend any div with whatever's behind it, and background blend mode will mix a background image with the color set on the same div, background color. So here you can see this is normal. This is using mix blend mode, not background blend mode. So with mix blend mode, we can then say screen, and the entire div then blends with whatever's behind it. It's so important to think about accessibility when you're doing this. Make sure that when you're reviewing comps that, if you swap out something behind it, it's not going to cause issues. If this entire background image were white, for example, this text would not be legible. So this is something to keep very much in mind. Have lots of user guidelines around what to place there. Yes?
What's the difference between a blend mode and opacity?
A blend mode allows you to do a little bit more complex things than opacity. So opacity will give you just an overall shift in how transparent it is. Whereas blend mode, you can set specific things like multiply, darken, that kind of thing. The filters that you would find in Photoshop, basically. So you have 4 different settings for this that are basically to reset your blend mode, and those are first initial, inherit, unset, and normal. These are pretty basic. They match up with a lot of other CSS declarations that do this. Then we have a bunch more. So the first 2 I've listed here are multiply and screen. These are the ones that I find myself using the most. So basically, any dark part of the image is going to make whatever's in front of it darker as well if you're using multiply. Whereas with screen, it'll lighten the elements. And then there are a few more of these which do very similar things. I would recommend going into your browser and basically just tabbing through them to see which one is right for your use case. But you can do overlay and darken and lighten and color dodge. A few more, color burn, hard light, soft light. This is incredibly powerful, and it's so amazing that they finally included this, because before we would have to use opacity, right? And it was imperfect because then everything inside of it would be transparent as well, and you would get weird side effects. That said, opacity is a great fallback for this if you really need it to be there. But this is like an added layer. More. All right, so if you want to set a blend mode on your background image, you can't do it directly in the shorthand. You have to make an extra line that says background blend mode, kind of like background size sometimes. And then, so again, plugging accessibility here. It's a concern for all of us, but if you can find a way to set your blend modes so that your text is still legible when you're using this, especially if you're using text over images, please try to do so. What I do is I create before elements, and then they'll be semi-transparent. I'll set an opacity on them and set it to be behind the text. And then I'll set the blend mode on the before element itself instead of on the entire div, so that I can get that color on top of whatever image is behind it, but I'm not running into issues in older browsers. So, there's no IE for this, I'm sorry. Safari has problems with multiple background blend modes. I haven't had a use case for using multiple, but there you have it. And then Firefox sometimes has problems with mixed blend mode. Again, do your testing, be responsible with your code. Just because I tell you that you can do it doesn't mean that you can do it. Even I am human. But I have had very good success with this on my sites, using fallbacks like setting before elements and transitions, color changes on the background behind it. Finally, textured typography. So this is basically a use for background clip. This is for cases where you have text that needs to have some kind of texture over top of it. A lot of the demos that you'll see out there have like flame texture over top of text, which is bizarre. But we have found really good uses for it. On the homepage of National Park Foundation, we used it to create this tree ring texture with an SVG, and then you can see right through it to the image behind it. So no matter the image, you don't have to worry about like, oh, we have to go back and adjust that text image that's over top of it again. This will work right away. And then additionally, even if you don't need the opacity there, you can set textures like this. This is a little bit better supported and easier to set up your fallbacks because you can just set the color of the text to be navy and then put your image on top of that. And if the image doesn't show up, it's still going to be navy. Whereas with the earlier example, you actually have to set the color of the text to be transparent. I set mine to be about 10% of whatever color I want it to be so that if my texture doesn't show up, I'm not just like, wait, my text isn't there at all. I know what's going on. It's a problem with the image itself. So for testing purposes, I find that to be really useful. So the way that you actually do this is with all of these wonderful vendor prefix options here, but it's basically background clip, and then I set my background color and size. But you can see here that I set the color of the text to be transparent, and then you also have to set your text fill color for WebKit to be transparent. That's one of those tricky items that will get you. Then basically, if it's not okay for your text not to have this texture in older browsers, you can't do this. If you're okay with graceful degradation and just having a solid color on the older browsers, then you're good to go. So negotiate that with your team a little bit. You can usually get in softly and people will be like, oh yeah, you can read it, that's cool. Trying to keep an eye for the future as opposed to always in the past. So the most important part of this is the browser hack at the bottom. I wrapped all of my textures in this and then created a mix-in out of it so that I could place my texture on the various H2s, H3s that I needed to throughout the site. This is risky. I did this because we have a maintenance contract with National Park Foundation. If browsers stop supporting this browser hack, or if it becomes obsolete and now like new browsers won't render your content anymore because it's inside of this browser hack, then you're going to run into problems. So really useful, but be responsible. Finally, here are links to all of the resources and references that I used today. This link at the bottom, again, is the slide deck, so that you can go and just like click on the links. And I'll also tweet it. But basically, browser hacks is where I got that browser hack from. It's really useful for those one-off edge cases, but like don't fill your whole theme with them. Try and use it very carefully. And then Tympanus, so call them code drops because that's where they put all their tutorials and demos, is incredibly useful for finding those cutting edge things. If you find that you're always looking at somebody else's site and being like, how did they do that? Nobody ever tells me about these things. you can sign up for CodeDrops' newsletter, and they send about one email per week with a tutorial in it. Oftentimes it's like pretty bleeding edge, but it's still a good way to get thinking about these new tools. And be brave. Any questions? Okay, all right. If you guys want to tweet at me or email me, I have business cards here. I'm semi-active on Twitter, more so during conferences. So, this week is a good time to talk to me. So let me know. And our website is agencychief.com if you want to look at our job postings or our work.